The great hall of Ironveil had never burned brighter. Every torch along the stone walls blazed at full height. The long oak tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, braided bread, clay jugs of dark wine, and the kind of food that only appears when a pack has something enormous to celebrate. Warriors beat their fists against the tables in rolling waves of thunder. Voices rose and tangled with the music until the rafters seemed to vibrate with it. Children too young to understand the victory still felt it running between the benches, laughing, drunk on the energy of adults who had been holding their breath for 3 days and were finally, completely, exhaling. Ironveil had crushed the Voss rogue faction. 41 wolves, 3 days of hard, relentless fighting across the eastern ridge and the lowland marshes, not a single loss on Ironveil's side. It was the kind of victory that didn't just end a conflict. It sent a message to every territory within 3 mountain ranges. Do not test this pack. Do not test this Alpha. And Alpha King Marmon Richmond stood at the center of it all, exactly where he always stood, at the heart of every room, pulling its gravity toward him without trying. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the deep charcoal ceremonial armor of Ironveil's ruling line, the silver crest at his chest catching the torchlight every time he moved. His jaw was sharp. His posture was easy. He was laughing now, head tilted back, one arm loose at his side, the kind of man who looked like authority even when he was simply standing still and enjoying a drink. He looked like a king who had everything. High above all of it, tucked into the carved stone gallery that curved along the upper wall of the great hall, Lyra Finch stood alone. She had a goblet in her hand. She had not drunk from it. She stood half behind the heavy curtain of midnight blue velvet that framed the gallery's edge, close enough to the railing to see the whole hall below, but not close enough to be easily seen from it. Her copper hair was loose tonight, falling past her shoulders in the way it only did when she had stopped caring about appearances. Her pale green dress was the same one she had worn to the last 3 formal dinners, not because she had nothing else, but because choosing something different required a kind of hope she had not been able to locate today. The silver embroidery at the hem caught the torchlight from below, tiny scattered stars against the fabric. Her other hand, the one not holding the goblet, rested low against her stomach. She had not meant for it to go there. It simply had. Habit. Now, in the 8 days since she had sat on the cold stone floor of the bathing chamber and understood what was growing inside her. She found Marmon easily in the crowd below. She always found him easily. The mating bond made that unavoidable a low, persistent pull in her chest, like a compass needle that had been calibrated to only one direction. She had stopped fighting it weeks ago. Now she just let it point, and tried to feel nothing when it did. He was laughing with Lorelei Conway. Lorelei wore red tonight. Not the deep, careful red of a woman trying to be noticed. The bright, unthinking red of a woman who had never doubted she would be. Her golden hair was loose over her shoulders, and she was leaned into Marmon with the easy, unconscious closeness of someone who had never once been asked to keep her distance. She said something and touched his arm, and he laughed again, louder this time, his head dipping slightly toward her. Lyra watched. She told herself, the way she had been telling herself for 3 months, that she felt nothing. Her hand pressed a little tighter against her stomach. Then Valerie Haskins stepped in close from the other side. Valerie was Ironveil's senior court strategist, a woman in her 40s with cold, measuring eyes and a face that never quite stopped calculating something. She wore a dark, perfectly tailored gown, and she leaned toward Marmon with the practiced ease of a woman who had been standing in that exact position for 5 years. Her voice was low, controlled, passing along information, the way she always passed along information, as if the words were simply facts and the consequences were simply geography. Lyra could not hear it from the gallery. She moved closer to the railing. The music dipped, just a breath, just a heartbeat of quiet between one song and the next, and the voices below rose just enough to fill it. She still looks like she's visiting, Lorelei said, soft and amused, even after all this time. A beat. 2. Marmon's laugh, short, careless, completely at ease, filled that small space. She was never really meant to stay long. The music surged back. The hall roared. The moment closed like water closing over a stone, and every voice below continued, and every torch kept burning, and no one in that bright, celebratory room looked up at the gallery above them. No one noticed the Luna of Ironveil standing in the dark, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, her jaw set, her spine completely straight. She stood there for 4 full minutes. She counted. She did not know why she counted. She just did. 4 minutes of standing above a celebration that had never truly included her. 4 minutes with her hand against the place where something small and new and entirely unplanned was quietly, stubbornly growing. Then she turned and walked away from the railing and descended the stone stairs toward the corridor below. Because no one in that hall knew what she was carrying. No one knew the small life already moving inside her, the Alpha's child, the Pack's future, the heir to everything Marmon Richmond had built and defended and bled for. And by the time the sun rose over Ironveil's stone towers, Lyra would be gone. Number. Chapter 1. Times the arrangement. 3 months before the night of the celebration, Lyra had arrived at Ironveil in a borrowed dress and a borrowed smile. She was 23 years old. She had grown up in Thornfield Pack, a mid-sized territory, 2 mountain ridges to the east. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and Sunday meals stretched until the light was gone, and someone always fell asleep in a chair. Her father, Lyra Finch, was Thornfield's beater, a quiet, careful man, with steady hands and the kind of grief behind his eyes that comes from raising 3 daughters alone. Lyra's mother, Clara, had died when Lyra was 15. There was no dramatic story to it. A winter illness that moved fast and stayed. One morning, Lyra Finch was warm and laughing at the kitchen table, and 3 weeks later she was not, and Lyra had looked at her 2 younger sisters, Mabel, 11, and Pearl, 9, and made a decision. Somebody had to be the person who did not fall apart. She had been that person ever since. She was not weak. Nobody who had done what she had done at 15 could honestly be called weak. But she was gentle. She was the kind of person who noticed when someone's cup was empty before they did, who remembered the name of every wolf she met, who could sit with a grieving elder for 2 hours, saying almost nothing, and leave them feeling less alone. In Thornfield, that gentleness was understood. It was valued. In a court like Ironveil's, she would learn very quickly. It was sometimes mistaken for something that could be moved around. The union between Lyra and Alpha King Marmon Richmond had been arranged by the Territorial Council 6 years into a border dispute that everyone knew was becoming something worse. 2 wolves had already died in a confrontation along the eastern ridge, a confrontation both packs officially called an accident. The council knew better. They had been watching the tension build like water behind a dam, and they had done what councils always do when the water gets high enough. They found a solution that cost the least to the most. A marriage. Thornfield's beta daughter to Ironveil's Alpha King. Political union. Binding agreement. Peace through bond. Lyra was not consulted. She was informed. She had sat in the cold, formal council chamber with her father beside her and listened to men she had never met explain the shape of her future. She had watched Ephraim's hands tighten around the arms of his chair, that careful man, trying very hard to hold something back that was large and painful. She had put her hand over his and pressed once, gently. "It's all right," the gesture said. "I understand." And she did. She understood what another confrontation would cost in lives, in grief, in the kind of damage that does not heal cleanly. She understood that her father's pack, her home, her sister's home, would bear that cost more than Ironveil would, because Thornfield was smaller and always had been. She understood that this was the kind of choice that was not really a choice at all. It only wore the shape of one. "Yes," she had said. Her voice had been steady. She met Marmon Richmond twice before the ceremony. The first time was at the border negotiation table, a long formal meeting with council members on both sides, and too many documents and not enough windows. Marmon sat across from her, and for the duration of that meeting, he said nothing to her directly, not a single word. She told herself, later, that it wasn't dismissal. She had learned by then that silence was simply how he processed things, that he gathered information before he responded to any of it. But in that first hour, sitting across the table from him while he studied the maps and the documents and the faces of the council members as if cataloguing every variable in the room, his quiet felt like a wall she had not been given a door through. The second time was the day before the ceremony. Bess Turlough, Ironveil's head of guard, a broad-shouldered woman with close-cropped silver hair and the steady, weathered face of someone who had seen more than she ever discussed, had organized a brief walk of the pack grounds. She walked 3 paces ahead with the deliberate, cheerful obliviousness of a person working very hard not to appear to be doing exactly what she was doing. Marmon pointed out the eastern tree line and explained it marked the edge of rogue territory. Lyra looked at it for a moment. "It's very tall," she said. He looked at her then. Just once, quickly a flicker of something in his expression, almost like amusement, gone before it fully arrived. And then he looked back at the tree line, and they walked in silence the rest of the way back. That was all they had, going into the ceremony. The mating rite was performed in Ironveil's great hall, at the stone altar that had stood at its center for 200 years. Lyra stood in white. The hall was half full. Invited witnesses, council members, pack elders. It was small and formal and efficient, and when the rite completed and the mating bond settled into Lyra's chest, it did not feel like warmth. It did not feel like recognition. It felt like standing at the edge of a very great height in the dark, knowing the ground was down there somewhere, unable to see how far. Marmon received the bond with the same expression he gave everything. Still, controlled. Processing. Lyra pressed her hand against the center of her chest, where the bond had landed, and breathed. The weeks that followed were not cruel. That was the thing she found hardest to explain to herself, how something can be painful without a single act of cruelty attached to it. Marmon was not cold. He thanked her when she attended pack dinners. He updated her on territory decisions as a courtesy, so she would not be uninformed. He never raised his voice. He never dismissed her from a room. He simply never truly looked at her the way a person looks when they are trying to understand another person, when they are genuinely curious about what is behind the eyes across from them. She moved through his house, their house, like a guest who had stayed too long and was too well-mannered to say so. She cooked sometimes, because cooking was the one thing that had always felt like firm ground under her feet. The kitchen at Ironveil was large and warm, and smelled of old herbs and iron, and on the mornings she came down early to cook, Bess Turlough always found a reason to be in there. She would sit at the far end of the long table with a stack of patrol schedules and a mug of something hot, and pretend, with enormous concentration, to be entirely absorbed in her work. "You don't have to keep me company," Lyra said one morning, setting a pot of herb broth on the fire. "I'm not keeping you company," Bess said, not looking up. "I'm reviewing patrol logistics. It's coincidence that it always smells better in here than anywhere else in the keep." Lyra laughed properly, for the first time since she had arrived at Ironveil. It was small and real and surprised her. In the 4th week, Gundred Mills came to find her. Gundred was the oldest wolf in Ironveil, a small woman somewhere north of 70, with deep brown eyes and the face of someone who had lived long enough to find most things either survivable or quietly funny. She had been the pack's elder healer for 40 years. She brought Lyra a clay pot of herb blend and sat across from her at the kitchen table as if they had known each other since childhood. "They're watching you," Gundred said, without preamble. "Most of them are waiting to see if you're worth following. The ones who aren't waiting have already made up their minds." She looked at Lyra steadily. "You know which category Valerie Haskins falls into." Lyra had already figured that out. Valerie had been Marmon's senior court strategist for 5 years. She was sharp, effective, entirely devoted to Ironveil's growth on her own terms, according to her own design. From the day Lyra arrived, Valerie had been perfectly polite. The particular politeness of a woman who has assessed you and decided you are not a serious threat, but intends to keep watching just in case. Every interaction was smooth. Every conversation was measured. Every courtesy was extended with just enough warmth to be unremarkable and just enough precision to be a message. "What do I do?" Lyra asked. "Be exactly who you are," Gundred said. "The right ones will see it. The wrong ones will eventually show themselves." Lyra held on to that in the weeks that followed. She tried. She attended every formal event. She learned the names of every wolf in the pack, not just the council members and the senior guards, but the kitchen workers, the stable hands, the young warriors still in their first year of training. She asked about their families. She remembered the answers. She sat with the elder wolves at meals and listened to their histories without checking the time. She was present and warm and genuinely trying, and she told herself on the harder nights that it was enough, that the trying was enough. She did not yet know what was coming. Chapter 2 times 3 months of silence. The first real conversation Lyra had with Marmon, not a formal exchange, not a courtesy update, but an actual conversation happened in the library, 42 days after the ceremony. She had been there since after dinner, sitting in the deep chair nearest the fire with a volume of Ironveil's Pack history spread across her lap. She had been trying to understand the territory she had been bonded to. The disputes, the alliances, the old grievances still faintly alive in the present. If she was going to be Luna of this pack, in anything more than title, she needed to understand its bones. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps in the corridor unhurried, measured, the particular rhythm she had already memorized without meaning to. He appeared in the doorway and stopped. He looked at her for a moment. She looked at him. "You're still up," he said. "Yes," she said. "There's quite a lot of history." He stood in the doorway. The firelight was between them. She waited, genuinely uncertain whether he would come in or go on. He almost crossed the room. She could see it, something in the set of his shoulders, a slight shift of weight, a breath. Then it passed. "Good night," he said, and left. She stared at the empty doorway for a long time after that, holding the book in her lap, feeling the mating bond pull gently in her chest, like a tide that could not quite reach the shore. The scout duo found her the following morning. Harlan Doolin was Ironveil's Eastern Patrol lead, a loose-limbed, energetic man with an opinion about everything and an inability to share fewer than 3 of them at any given time. Clyde Cross was his partner, compact, patient, with the enduring expression of a man who had long ago made peace with his lot in life. They encountered Lyra in the armory corridor near the east wing, and Harlan, apparently taking this as an invitation, immediately began explaining the architectural significance of the eastern wall carvings, the history of the corridor's construction, and a theory he had about the original builder's intention. Clyde let him get 4 sentences in. "She didn't ask," Clyde said. "I was providing context," Harlan said, affronted. "You were providing a lecture." "There is a difference." "There is not." Lyra found herself laughing again. Harlan looked gratified. Clyde looked at Lyra with the steady, measuring look of someone deciding whether she could be trusted, and then said, "He apologizes. He can't help it." "I don't apologize," Harlan said. "He does," Clyde said. After that, she looked for them at meals. They were easy company, Harlan filling every silence, Clyde editing him in real time. Both of them clearly fond of each other in the way that people are fond of someone they have suffered alongside long enough that the suffering has become a kind of affection. Bess continued her vigil at the kitchen table. It became, without anyone formally acknowledging it, the one reliable part of Lyra's days at Ironveil. She would cook in the early morning, and Bess would be there, not hovering, not asking anything of her, just present, a warmth in the room that did not require explanation. The mating bond was a more complicated thing. It was always there. A low, continuous awareness in her chest, a warmth she could not turn off and could not fully lean into. Not when the man on the other side of it moved through the same house with the careful formality of someone managing a difficult professional arrangement. She would feel him before she saw him sometimes, feel the bond shift from distant to near when he entered a room, and she would have to work to keep her expression neutral, to not let it show on her face that something in her had noticed. One evening, returning from a long training session with the senior warriors, Marmon passed through the courtyard where Lyra was sitting with Gundred and two of the elder wolves, listening to a story about Ironveil's founding. He slowed. He did not stop, but he slowed, and he looked at her, really looked, for just a moment, and something moved across his face that she could not quite name. She told herself it did not mean anything. She told herself that every day. Then Valerie made her first open move. It was at the formal pack dinner that marked the end of the second month. The hall was full, every seat taken, the fire burning high. Lyra was at the high table beside Marmon, doing what she had learned to do well, making the elder wolves feel heard, refilling cups before they were empty, carrying herself with the quiet, settled presence of a woman who belonged where she sat. She was doing well. She knew she was doing well. Valerie leaned across the table from 3 seats down. Her voice carried precisely as far as she intended, far enough for the 4 nearest wolves to hear, soft enough to seem innocent. The Luna must be tired after such a long evening. Perhaps she'd be more comfortable retiring early. The celebration will go quite late. The words were smooth. The implication was a stone under the water. You don't belong at this table. Lyra felt it land. She felt the 4 nearby wolves register it. She felt the slight shift in the room, the particular social electricity of people waiting to see how she would respond. She smiled. She set down her cup gently. How thoughtful, Valerie. I'll take that under consideration. And she stayed. She stayed for another hour, and she poured wine for the senior council members, and she listened to 2 hours of territorial history from the eldest pack elder, and she did not let a single thing show on her face. But she walked to the east garden alone afterward, in the cold, and stood in the dark until she was sure her hands had stopped shaking. 8 days before the great feast, Gundred came to her. Lyra had not called for her. Gundred simply arrived at the bathing chamber door, soft knock, no pause, and entered the way she always entered. The way a person enters a room where they have been needed before, carrying the specific calm of someone who knew, walking in, exactly what they were about to find. Lyra was sitting on the cold stone floor with her back against the wall. Gundred sat down beside her. How far? She said. 5 weeks. Maybe 6. Lyra's voice was steady. She had been working on steady all morning. Gundred took her hand. The way a person holds something they are afraid of dropping. Does he know? No. Are you going to tell him? Lyra looked at the wall across the room for a long time. The silence was not uncomfortable. Gundred let it be. I was going to wait, Lyra said finally, until things were clearer between us, until I understood better where I stood. Gundred said nothing. She simply held Lyra's hand a little tighter. That had been 8 days ago. On the night of the feast, going into the great hall beside Marmon, Lyra had still been telling herself, tonight, she would find the right moment. Tonight, she would tell him. She had been carrying this alone long enough. The mating bond between them was real. Whatever the distance, it was real, and it was his child too, and he deserved to know. She had almost told herself she was ready. Then she had climbed to the gallery for air. And the moment she had been gathering her courage for dissolved, completely and permanently, on a careless laugh and 8 words. She was never really meant to stay long. Number, Chapter 3. Times what the gallery heard. The descent from the gallery took less than a minute. Lyra walked the stone stairs carefully, one hand on the wall, the torches at each landing casting her shadow long and thin behind her. She was not rushing. There was no need to rush. There was nowhere she was going to arrive too late to stop what had already been said, and she had learned a long time ago that movement done in panic rarely went anywhere useful. She reached the corridor at the base of the stairs and stood there for a moment. The sound of the celebration was muffled here, the music, the voices, the drums. She could feel the vibration of it in the stone under her feet. She thought about how many times in the past 3 months she had stood just outside a room full of people who belonged to a life she had been placed into, feeling the edges of it, never quite getting to the center. She thought about the child. She pressed her hand against her stomach and stood in the corridor for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she turned toward the chamber stairs and walked. The great chamber she shared with Marmon was dark when she arrived. The fire had not been lit for the evening, yet the staff expected them to stay at the celebration until late. Lyra did not light it. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and let the darkness be what it was. She did not cry. She had made a decision about crying alone in dark rooms. She had made it at 15, sitting in her mother's empty bedroom 3 days after the funeral, and she had kept it since. Crying alone in the dark was a thing she allowed herself exactly once per wound, and she used it carefully, because she had learned that if you spent all of it the first night, you would have nothing left for the nights that mattered more. This was not that night. So instead, she thought the way she had learned to think when she was 15 clearly, without flinching, with the specific steadiness of a person who has already established that falling apart is not among their available options. She laid the facts out, the way you lay out a map, without sentiment, and looked at what was actually there. Marmon had laughed. He had laughed at 8 words that reduced her to a temporary arrangement. He had not flinched. He had not stepped back from Lorelei. He had not looked up at the gallery where his mate stood in the dark. Valerie had been standing close enough to hear her own words land, and Lyra had been carrying his child for 5 weeks without telling him, inside a home where she had never once felt she had the right to take up space. She thought about what it meant to bring a child into this. Not the politics, not the alliance, the daily reality of it. A child who would grow up watching his mother be managed and moved around by a woman who had already decided she did not belong. A child who would see his father laugh at his mother's expense in a bright, crowded room full of witnesses. She thought about the mating bond. It was real. She was not pretending it wasn't. The bond did not care about circumstances or dignity or the things people said in lit halls. It was old and deep, and it simply pulled toward its other half the way water pulls toward the lowest point. She had felt it every day for 3 months. She felt it now, sitting in the dark, pointing steadily in Marmon's direction as he laughed below in the great hall. But she had also learned something in 3 months that she had not known before. A bond without respect was just a beautiful cage. She rose. She moved through the chamber quietly, with the calm precision of someone who has already completed the internal argument and is now simply doing the next thing. From beneath the bed she pulled the traveling satchel she had brought from Thornfield, soft, worn leather, familiar weight. She had kept it. She had not been able to explain to herself why she kept it. Now she understood. Her mother's ring, a thin copper band, almost no weight at all from the small box on the bedside table. Gundred's herb jar from the windowsill. The worn shawl that smelled faintly of Thornfield's pine forest, and her father's house, and everything that had existed before this. She left one thing. On the pillow where Marmon would sleep, she placed her lunar crest. The silver pendant, a wolf's profile set in a crescent, that Marmon himself had placed around her neck at the mating ceremony. She set it down carefully, making no sound, and she looked at it for a moment in the dark. No note. There were no words that would not be argued with, picked apart, used to diminish what she was doing into something smaller than it was. The pendant said everything. The empty side of the bed said the rest. She picked up the satchel and walked to the door. The corridor outside was quiet. The night guards at the east passage, 2 young wolves, relatively new to their post, saw her approaching and straightened. They looked at the satchel. They looked at her face. Neither of them had ever been told what to do if the Luna walked out through the east passage in the middle of the night carrying a bag, because no one had ever thought to tell them. She nodded to them politely, the way she had always nodded to everyone at Ironveil seeing them, meaning it, and walked through the passage and into the dark. The forest at the edge of the grounds did not feel hostile. It felt like the first honest thing she had encountered in 3 months. It was cold, and it was quiet, and it smelled of pine and soil, and the particular clean of air that has never been filtered through stone, and it received her the way open land receives a person who has been inside too long. She walked. Number chapter. 4 times what she built. Lyra walked for 2 full days before she allowed herself to stop. Not because she was afraid of being followed, she knew the pack's search patterns, had learned them in the first weeks simply by listening and paying attention at table, and she moved deliberately against them. She walked routes that left no clear pattern. She moved along creek beds where tracks don't hold. She used the moss and the light and the things her mother had taught her about reading a forest from the inside. Lyra Finch had been a practical woman. She had believed, firmly, that the best thing you could give a child was competence, not comfort, not protection, but the actual knowledge of how to manage, how to find water when you had none, how to determine direction without markers, which plants treated fever, and which caused it. She had taught all of this to Lyra before she was 12, and Lyra had taught it to Maybelle and Pearl after she was gone, and now it lived in Lyra's hands and her feet and her instincts as naturally as breathing. On the 3rd morning, she reached neutral territory. It was old land, ungoverned, unclaimed, held in the careful preservation of the ancient agreement that divided the 3 surrounding territories. Nobody built here. Nobody hunted it regularly. The forest was genuinely wild in the way forests are when human and wolf hands have not touched them in decades, taller, denser, stranger, full of the particular silence of a place that has had time to become entirely itself. She found the shelter on the 2nd afternoon. It was small and stone, 4 walls and a low roof, built by some long-ago trapper who was bones now, solid and dry, and set back from the main game trail far enough to be invisible unless you were looking for it. She spent the rest of that day clearing it. Decades of debris and leaves, and the small evidence of animals using it as a seasonal shelter. She packed the gaps in the stone with moss from the creek bank and grey clay from the water's edge. She found what she needed for a fire-dry wood stacked under the overhang on the east side, as if someone had left it, and she built a small, almost smokeless fire and ate what she had carried. And in the evening, when the neutral forest went still around her, and the only sound was the fire and the distant movement of water over stone, she sat with her hand against her stomach. "Well," she said quietly, "here we are." The words went up into the low dark of the stone ceiling and settled there. She built her days around what needed doing, and the simplicity of that was, she discovered, a kind of relief she had not known she was missing. Water at dawn, food before midday. Rest in the afternoon. She had stopped fighting the deep, bone-level tiredness of early pregnancy, had stopped telling herself she should push through it, and in lying down for an hour each afternoon, she found she had more steadiness for the rest of the day. Foraging in the evening. Sleep. She was not happy. Exactly. She was too honest with herself for pretend happiness, but she was something that felt more essential than happy. She was grounded. She was herself. She was, for the first time since she had stood in the council chamber and said yes to a room full of men who had not asked her what she wanted entirely, only herself. The mating bond still ached. It would ease during the day when she was moving and occupied, and then return in the evenings when the forest went still and there was nothing between her and it. She had stopped trying to block it out. blocking it, used energy she needed for other things, and it didn't work anyway. The bond simply was. It pulled toward Marmon the way a tide pulls toward shore, low and constant and undeniable. She sat with it in the evenings and let it be what it was, and she did not let it make her decisions. In the evenings, she talked to the baby. She had started doing it on the fourth night, not as a plan, but because the silence had felt strange and she had needed to put words into it, and the only honest thing she had to say was what she was thinking, and what she was thinking was mostly addressed to the small person growing inside her. She talked the way her mother had talked to her, directly, honestly, without the particular condescension some adults use when they speak to the very young, as if intelligence only arrives after a certain height. "I don't know exactly what we're doing yet," she said one evening, watching the small fire. "But I know we are going to be all right. I know that because I've been in a harder version of this before, and I found my way through it. We will too." The baby said nothing, but something settled, a shift she felt more than understood, a small and certain agreement passing between them in the quiet, and she smiled. Some nights the bond ached sharply enough that she sat up in the dark and felt the pull as almost physical, a hand reaching from somewhere far off, insistent, uncertain. On one of those nights she came close to packing. She sat on the edge of the narrow sleeping mat with her hands in her lap and the mating bond pressing steadily at her chest, and thought, "He doesn't know. He doesn't know about the baby. He might be different if he knew." She sat with that thought for a long time. Then another thought, quieter and firmer. He didn't know about the bond either. He felt it the same day I did, and knowing didn't change how he carried it. She lay back down. She slept. The weeks accumulated quietly. The stone shelter became a home in the small, specific ways that places become homes. The firewood stacked just so. The herbs hung to dry from a beam. The cloth stretched between two pines on clear days when the washing needed doing. She found wild garlic along the creek bank and late rose hips and pine bark she could boil for warmth and mineral. Her body rounded slowly, and she moved differently to account for it, and the forest accommodated her without commentary. 6 weeks in, she was visibly pregnant. She sat one evening on the flat rock above the creek, watching the water below, her hand resting over the curve of her stomach. The neutral forest was dark around her and quiet, and the mating bond was there in her chest where it always was, and somewhere far to the west, beyond 3 ridgelines and the memory of stone corridors and formal dinners and a silver pendant on a dark pillow, Alpha King Marmon Richmond was either looking for her or he was not. She did not yet know which. Number. Chapter 5. Times what the letters said. Marmon Richmond found the pendant at dawn. He woke, and the first thing he noticed was the cold, not the cold of the room, the cold of the empty space beside him, the shallow impression in the bedding where a person had been and was not. He lay still for a moment, not yet understanding, and then he sat up and looked at the pillow. The silver lunar crest lay in the grey morning light, catching none of it. He picked it up, held it. Its weight was small and enormous at the same time. He was at Bess Turlow's door in less than 2 minutes. She opened it, looked at him standing in the corridor with the lunar crest in his hand, and said nothing. She dressed in 30 seconds and followed him without being asked. The night guards confirmed what the pendant had already told them. The Luna had walked through the east passage before the 2nd hour of morning, carrying a traveling satchel. She had not been running. She had walked with the quiet, deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Marmon stood at the open east gate in the early cold and stared at the tree line. "Assemble search parties," he said. "Already in process," Bess said. By mid-morning, the pack knew. The knowing moved through Ironveil the way everything moves through a pack immediately and in every direction at once, growing additional details as it went. The Luna had left in the night. The Luna had taken almost nothing. The Luna had left her crest on the pillow. Harlan had a theory. He explained it to Clyde at length in the armory. Rogue retaliation, Harlan said. The Voss faction isn't fully disbanded. Someone could have... She packed a bag, Harlan, Clyde said, under duress. She walked out on her own, not running. Packed. Harlan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. She left, Clyde said quietly, setting down the blade he had been cleaning. On purpose. And before we find her, we need to understand why. Because if we bring her back to the same thing she walked away from, we haven't done anything. The armory was quiet for a moment. When did you get wise? Harlan asked, sounding genuinely surprised. I've always been wise, Clyde said. You just talk too much to notice. 3 search parties went out that first day. Then more. For 6 days, nothing. On the 7th morning, Bess stood across the desk from Marmon in the study with the careful expression of a woman delivering difficult information to someone who had not been sleeping properly. She knows how to move through forest, Bess said. She's not leaving tracks the way someone lost or frightened would. She's deliberate. She's choosing her routes. She doesn't want to be found. Marmon looked at his hands on the desk. Keep looking, he said. She's likely in neutral territory by now, Alpha. If she's crossed into... Keep looking, Bess. Bess left. In the corridor outside, Harlan was waiting with a freshly compiled map of every rogue sighting in the past month, which he had prepared anyway, despite being told twice that it was not relevant. Bess looked at it, then at Harlan. Not now, she said. Harlan tucked the map under his arm with dignity. 3 weeks into the search, Harlan found the letters. He had been in the Pack archive looking for neutral zone records, old trapper routes, historical shelter locations, any map that might give the search parties new ground to cover. Harlan was a loud researcher, but a thorough one when pointed in the right direction, and he had been at it for hours when his hand found a bundle of correspondence filed under the wrong year's territorial records. He read the first letter once. Then, again. Clyde, he said. I'm not here, Clyde said from the doorway. You need to read this. Clyde entered. Read over Harlan's shoulder. Said nothing for a long time. The first set of letters were from Valerie Haskins to the External Border Council, predating the mating ceremony by nearly 4 weeks. They were not lies, exactly. Valerie was too precise for outright lies. They were shaped truths, careful constructions. The mating arrangement had been times necessary, she wrote, but the chosen mate was times uncertain, political, fragile. The Alpha's own instincts would likely times correct the situation naturally over time. The phrase of a woman who had been waiting, patiently, for something to break. The second set were letters to Lorelei Conway, warmer in tone, encouraging, positioning Lorelei as Marmon's times, natural companion times a woman the Pack recognized and responded to. Full of careful instructions disguised as friendly guidance. Be present at social events. Be easy and warm. Let things develop naturally. Lorelei, reading these letters, had believed she was being supported by a mentor. She had been a piece on a board. Harlan and Clyde took the letters to Bess within the hour. Bess read every page, her jaw tightening with each one. Pack Council, Harlan said. Alpha first, Bess said. She knocked on the study door. She entered. She placed the letters on the desk. Marmon read them slowly, with the careful attention of someone who does not allow themselves to react until they have understood everything completely. When he set the last page down, the silence that followed was the kind that comes before thunder dense and pressurized and full of something enormous that had not yet found its shape. How long? He said. Before the ceremony, Bess said. She was building this, before Lyra ever arrived. The silence stretched. The night of the feast. Marmon's voice was low and deliberate, as if he were reconstructing something aloud to make himself believe it. Valerie positioned me near Lorelei. She chose the moment. She created the conditions. He stopped. Something moved through his expression, not anger, exactly. Something heavier, and more personal than anger. And I. He stopped again. You said what she needed you to say, Bess told him quietly. Not because you were ordered to. Because she built it so that you would say it naturally. That's what makes it effective. It doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like the truth. Marmon stood, walked to the window. The tree line was visible from there, dark, still, holding nothing. She was on the gallery, he said. Not a question. The night guard saw her there before she came down, Bess said. Marmon put his hand flat against the cold glass. He stood there for a long time. The mating bond was in his chest where it had always been below and constant, and something he had spent 3 months at arm's length from. He had received it the day of the ceremony, and felt it settle into him like a truth he had not chosen and had not known how to carry gracefully. So he had carried it carefully instead. Distance rather than the wrong word. Stillness rather than stumbling. He had told himself it was the responsible choice, that formality was better than something half-formed and awkward that might make things worse. He understood now, staring at the tree line where his mate had walked into the dark, that silence had been its own kind of damage. He turned from the window. Double the search radius. I'm going into the field myself. Valerie was summoned to the study before he left. Marmon placed Lorelei's letters on the desk between them and waited. Valerie looked at them. She looked at Bess, standing at the door. She looked at Marmon. Something shifted in her expression, not guilt, but the specific recalculation of a strategist who has just discovered her position. I acted in what I believed were the best interests of this pack, she said. My mate is missing, Marmon said. The flatness in his voice made it worse than anger. She has been alone in the neutral forest for 3 weeks. She left because she heard words she should never have heard. In a moment you built for exactly that purpose, and you are standing in front of me and calling that the pack's best interest. Valerie said nothing. You stay in this pack, Marmon said. You don't leave while I am gone. When Lyra comes home, there will be a council. She will be there when it convenes. He picked up his coat and walked out. In the great hall kitchen, before the sun was fully up the next morning, Gundred Mills sat at the table with a pot of tea and a packed traveling satchel, as if she had simply been waiting. Marmon found her there when he came downstairs. Sit down, Gundred said. He sat, because when Gundred told you to sit, you sat. You are going to the forest. Not a question. Yes. Good. You are overdue. She wrapped both hands around her cup. There are things I should have told you sooner. I believed you might find your way there on your own. I was wrong to wait. She told him plainly the things Lyra had faced, what it had cost her to face them gracefully, the quiet strength she had brought to a court that had not extended its hand. She is not fragile, Alpha. She is the most quietly resilient wolf I have watched in 40 years in this pack. The fact that it took her walking into the dark for you to sit here and hear me say so. Gundred set down her cup. That is something you will need to sit with. What else do I need to know? Marmon said, after a long silence. Gundred looked at him over the rim of her cup, the eyes of a woman holding something enormous. When you find her, she said carefully, understand that she was not carrying only her grief when she left. Marmon went very still. He stood so fast the chair scraped back against the stone floor. Bess. Number. Chapter. 6 times 40 days. Marmon had been in the neutral forest for 11 days. He had ranged further than the search parties, further than the agreed grid, further than logic strictly justified, following the bond rather than maps or track patterns. The bond was always there, had always been there, but in the neutral forest it changed. The ache sharpened into direction. The distance became navigable. He moved through the old trees with the focus of a man who had stopped relying on anything except the most fundamental truth he had spent 3 months refusing to fully acknowledge, that she was his and he was hers. And he should have said so plainly and early, and without the armor of formality and pride. Bess walked beside him for the last 5 days. Harlan had identified creekbed scuff marks pointing northeast and had been prevented from coming along personally by Clyde, who blocked the doorway with his full body weight and said, with impressive calmness, that someone needed to coordinate communications between the field teams, and that Harlan was the person best suited to do so, for reasons Clyde listed quietly and in detail, while Harlan tried to get past him. Harlan stayed. He tripled the communication frequency. He drew 3 entirely new maps of the neutral zone from memory and archive records. He organized the incoming field supply rotations with extraordinary efficiency. He was, Clyde reflected later, a man who had desperately needed to be useful and had finally been given the correct box to put it in. 2 hours before Marmon found her, the bond changed again. From direction to presence, from pull to nearness. It was not gradual, it was a shift, sudden and distinct, like a light coming on in a dark room. He moved faster without making a decision to do so, and Bess kept pace behind him without comment. He smelled the fire first. Nearly smokeless, almost nothing, just a trace, just enough to confirm what the bond was already telling him. Then the shelter, half visible through a careful screen of pine branches someone had arranged deliberately, the firewood stacked with precision, cloth drying on a line. The specific, careful order of a place that someone was not just using but inhabiting. He stepped into the small clearing. Lyra appeared in the low doorway. She had been tending something inside. She straightened as she came out, and then she saw him, and she went completely still. The forest was quiet. Birds, somewhere high above, wind in the upper branches. The light through the pines was gray and soft, and it fell across her the way light falls across something it has no reason to rush. She was different. She was still Lyra, the copper hair, the pale green eyes, the particular quality of her attention when she was looking at something she was deciding how to feel about. But something in her posture had settled that had not been settled before. She stood in the doorway of that small stone shelter in the middle of neutral land, as if she belonged entirely to herself. As if she had found something here, something she had been searching for long before she ever arrived at Ironveil. Marmon took 3 steps toward her. Then he stopped, because she was not just standing in the doorway. Her hand rested low against her stomach, and her stomach was no longer flat. He stood in the clearing while the whole world rearranged itself around what he was seeing. His mate, 7 paces away, carrying a life he had not known existed. His child, growing in the woman he had left, standing alone at a celebration. Growing here in the wild, in a stone shelter she had rebuilt with her own hands and her own steady determination, because she had looked at the home he had offered her and decided, with absolute clarity, that it was not yet fit to receive what she was protecting. Bess stepped back to the tree line. She looked at the ground. "You came," Lyra said. Her voice was the same as he remembered, quiet, measured, not giving anything away until she understood what she was giving it to. He had missed that voice. He had not let himself know how much. "I would have kept looking forever," he said. A pause. "Forever is a long time." "I know," he breathed. "I know I have no right to ask for any of it. I know what you heard. I know what I said. I know that I didn't say it alone, but that does not make it something you should have had to hear." He stopped. "What I said was not the truth of what I feel. It was something I said in a moment that had been built for exactly that purpose, by someone who needed me to say it. And I am not using that as a defense. I am telling you because the truth matters, and you deserve to have it." Lyra was quiet, looking at him with the careful steadiness of a woman who had been disappointed before and had learned to take nothing on faith until she had turned it over and examined it completely. "Valerie," she said. "Yes. Did you know?" "No." He paused. "I suspected something was being managed around me. I didn't look hard enough at what it was." "I suspected too," Lyra said. "I didn't have proof. I just knew something was being arranged that I couldn't see the whole of." He looked at her, this woman who had come into his court alone and gentle, and had seen clearly what was happening around her, and had carried that knowledge quietly alongside everything else she had been carrying, without a single person to say it to. "I'm sorry," he said, not surrounded by explanation, not dressed in context, just the words. Lyra held his gaze for a long moment. "How long?" he said then, his eyes moving to her stomach. "Almost 5 months." The calculation landed. She had known before she left. She had stood on that gallery, carrying his child, and listened to him laugh. She had packed her bag and walked into the dark, and built a shelter in the neutral wild, and spent 5 weeks talking to their child in the evenings by a small fire, alone, because that was what she had needed to do to protect it. He crossed the clearing in 4 strides and stopped just short of her. "Can I?" he started. She took his hand. She placed it gently against her stomach. What he felt there, that small, certain movement pressing back against his palm, that entirely real thing pushing back as if to say, "Times, yes, I am here. I have been here times," undid something in him that he had been holding rigid for years, since the day leadership had settled on his shoulders and he had decided that feeling things openly was a risk he could not carry. He stood in a clearing in the neutral forest with his hand against his wife's stomach and understood, completely and without exit, exactly what he had nearly lost. He did not have words for it. He did not try for words. They stayed 2 nights in the forest before returning. They talked not the way they had spoken in the first weeks of the mating, not with the careful management of 2 people navigating a formal arrangement. They talked the way people talk, when all the scaffolding is finally down, and what is left is just 2 people, with nothing between them but the truth, and a fire, and the dark. He told her everything, the letters, the timeline, the pattern Valerie had been building before Lyra ever arrived, the way the feast had been arranged so that everything Valerie needed him to say was already in the air, waiting for him to say it naturally. Lyra listened without interrupting. She had the specific gift of people who understand that the most important things often live in the middle of a sentence rather than the end, and she listened all the way through to the end of everyone. "She's still in the pack?" Lyra said when he finished. "Yes. She stays until you come home. I want her to stand before the council. I want her to do it while you are sitting at that table." Lyra was quiet for a moment. Then, "I need you to understand something. I didn't leave because I stopped caring about this pack. I left because I had to decide whether what I was carrying deserved to be born into a home where his mother was described as a transaction." She looked at him directly, the way she always looked at things she was deciding to be completely honest about. No child should grow up watching their mother be dismissed. Not by anyone. Not by their father. Not by anyone. "You're right," Marmon said. He did not say it easily. He said it with the weight of a man who has understood something fully and is naming it without reduction. Lyra heard the difference. She held it. Later, the fire lower, the forest entirely still around them. "Tell me something true," she said, he thought. "The day you said the tree line was very tall, I almost laughed. I stopped myself, because I didn't know yet what to do with finding you funny. I have regretted stopping myself every single day since." Lyra looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then she smiled. Small and real, and entirely unhurried. "It was a very tall tree line," she said. He smiled back, the face of a man remembering something he had been slowly forgetting and was now carefully reclaiming. Number, chapter. 7 times what she came home to. Word moved through Ironveil before the official announcement. It moved the way things always move through a pack immediately, completely, and with a small number of additional details that had not been confirmed, and at least 2 that had been invented wholesale. By the time Marmon and Lyra came through the eastern forest trail toward the main approach, the pack had gathered at the gates, not because they were told to, because they came. Warriors and elders and kitchen workers and stable hands and young wolves in their first year of training, and the children who had run between the tables on the night of the victory feast, and the elder wolves who had been in this pack long enough to have watched 2 generations of Richmonds lead it. They gathered the way communities gather when something important is happening, and they have decided, collectively, that they will bear witness to it. Lyra came through the gates on horseback. Bess had thought of the horse, because Bess thought of everything with Marmon riding beside her and the morning light coming down through the pines in long, pale columns. The pack saw her differently. 3 months ago, she had been the arrangement, the peace offering, the gentle outsider from Thornfield who most of them had been watching with polite, careful distance, unsure. She had moved through their halls quietly, learning their names, sitting with their elders, filling cups before they were empty, and they had allowed it without fully opening to her because she had not yet been tested in the way this pack tested things. Now she came back from the wild. Her copper hair was loose, her traveling clothes were worn. Her posture carried something the old wolves recognized, without needing to name the particular carriage of a person who has been taken apart by something real and has come back put together differently. Sturdier, more settled in themselves. She had spent 40 days alone in the neutral forest, carrying a life, in a shelter she rebuilt with her own hands, and she had come back standing. The eldest wolves saw it first, then the warriors, then everyone. Gundred stood near the front of the gathered pack, her hands in her lap, her brown eyes steady. She looked at Lyra and nodded once, the particular nod of a woman who knew exactly how the story ended before it had finished telling itself, and had simply waited. Harlan was 3 rows back. His face was wet. "I'm not crying," he announced to the general space around him. "You are absolutely crying," Clyde said from beside him. "I have something in my eye." Both eyes. Evidently. Clyde. "It is fine," Clyde said, simply and firmly. "It is fine to cry, Harlan." Harlan wiped his face with his sleeve and said nothing else for a full 2 minutes, which was, Clyde reflected privately, a personal record. Valerie Haskins stood near the far wall. She had been told the night before by Bess, in the flat, factual manner Bess used for information she had decided should not be delivered with softness, that the Alpha and Luna were returning together. She had received this information with the composure she had always used. But the composure was performance now, and it had started to show at the edges. She watched Lyra ride through the gates. She watched the old wolves straighten. She watched the warriors nod. She watched Gundred standing near the front with the expression of someone who had always known, and she understood. Standing at the wall of the pack she had spent 5 years shaping to her vision, that she had made an error. Not a tactical error. Something more fundamental than that. She had looked at Lyra's gentleness and read it as weakness. She had looked at Lyra's quiet and read it as absence. She had not understood, and this was the thing she would sit with for a long time afterward, that some people are quiet not because they have nothing, but because they are holding something carefully. That quietness was not the same as smallness. That patience was not the same as being without teeth. She had underestimated a gentle woman and called it strategy. The Pack Council convened the following morning. The great hall, the same room that had burned with celebration on the night that broke everything, the same stone floor and long tables and high rafters, was arranged for formal proceedings. 7 council members at the long table, Bess at the door, Harlan and Clyde in the gallery above, where witnesses stood, Gundred in the front row of the witness bench, hands folded, missing nothing. Marmon at the head of the table, Lyra to his right. The Luna's seat had technically always existed. It had stood empty for 3 months while every wolf in the room had quietly, collectively pretended not to notice. Now she occupied it. Every wolf in the room noticed that too. The detail was small, and it was everything. Valerie was brought in. She stood before the council in her dark gown, spine straight, eyes composed. She managed, impressively, to look like she was attending a meeting she had organized rather than one she was being examined at. The letters were read aloud. All of them. the council correspondence, the letters to Lorelei. Every shaped truth and carefully constructed implication read into the formal record in Bess's flat, unhurried voice. Then Lorelei Conway was called. She came in without the red dress. She wore something simple and grey, and she looked like a woman who had not slept properly since a set of letters had been placed on her vanity table and the floor had shifted under everything she thought she knew. She stood before the council and she told the truth, all of it, every word of it, everything Valerie had said to her, every suggestion dressed as encouragement, every instruction passed as advice, every careful framing that had positioned Lorelei as a natural choice without ever once asking Lorelei if she wanted to be one. She said it with the steadiness of a woman who has decided that whatever comes next will at least begin from an honest place. When she finished, the eldest council member looked at Valerie. "Do you deny this?" Valerie was quiet for a moment. Then, with the composure of a woman who did not break in public even when she was breaking, I acted in what I believed were the best interests of this pack. The council chamber was very still. "You manipulated your alpha," the elder said. "You built circumstances designed to fracture a mating bond recognized by pack law. You fed shaped narratives to the border council, and you used a member of this pack as an instrument in your plan without her knowledge or her consent." A pause. "That is not the best interests of this pack. That is the best interests of your own vision of what this pack should be." Valerie said nothing. Marmon looked at her across the table. When he spoke, his voice was measured and completely honest, neither angry nor forgiving, simply clear. "You are the most effective strategist I have worked with, and you used that effectiveness to reach into something that belonged to this pack and pull at it until it broke. The Luna belongs to this pack. What grows between a mated pair belongs to this pack. The child they are carrying belongs to this pack." He held her gaze. "You decided your judgment was larger than all of that. It was not." The council deliberated for 1 hour. Valerie Haskins was removed from her position as senior court strategist. Her access to pack records was sealed. She was given 30 days to relocate to neutral territory. It was not banishment. The council did not reach for cruelty. But it was final, and it was firm, and every wolf in the room understood the weight of it. She walked out without looking back. Lyra watched her go. She felt no triumph. She had expected to feel something sharper, some relief with teeth in it, some satisfaction. Instead, she felt only the quiet, gradual release of something that had been pressing against her chest since the first week she arrived at Ironveil, and that she had been carrying alongside everything else without ever having a name for it. She breathed out, slowly. Marmon reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand and held it. The baby came on a night in late autumn. The leaves had long since gone from the oaks outside the keep window, and the first frost had arrived 2 weeks earlier, and the fire in the great chamber had been burning since midday. Gundred had been in the room since the 3rd hour of labor, calm, unhurried, present in the way she was present for everything, completely, without noise. Marmon was there. He had asked. In the 7th month, in the quiet way he had learned to ask for things, not as a declaration, but as a genuine request, offered and retractable. "I want to be there. If that is all right with you." "Of course it is," Lyra had said. "I just wanted to ask, rather than assume." She had looked at him with the specific expression she reserved for moments when he did something that showed her the precise distance he had traveled from who he had been. "Marmon," she had said. "Yes? You're being so careful. Is that—" It's almost funny. He had looked briefly, helplessly pleased. She had filed that look away. The labor was long, and it was hard. Lyra did not ask for what she could manage without, and she managed without quite a lot. But when Gundred told her to take her husband's hand, she took it with both of hers and held it, and did not let go, and felt the mating bond in her chest shift from its long ache into something that was simply warm. The baby arrived in the small hours, loud and furious, and entirely unimpressed by the occasion of his own birth. He was large and healthy, and absolutely outraged at the temperature, which Gundred noted privately, setting him into Lyra's arms, was already a very Ironveil appropriate response to the world. Marmon sat on the edge of the bed. His son had Lyra's coloring, the copper tinge at his hairline, the particular warmth of his skin, already visible in these first minutes. But he had his father's jaw. Clearly, already, unmistakably, that jaw which Gundred noted would likely make him look formidably serious from a very young age, which was, all things considered, a reasonable inheritance. He was the next Alpha King of Ironveil. He was the reason Valerie had tried to clear the board. He was the thing Lyra had walked into the dark to protect before anyone knew he needed protecting, and had spent 40 days in a stone shelter in the neutral wild, talking to, honestly and directly, because she believed, as her mother had believed before her, that even very small people deserve to be spoken to as if they are already themselves. He was, in the way of all newborns, entirely uninterested in the weight of his significance, and mostly concerned with being warm. "Hello," Lyra said quietly, her lips close to the top of his head. "I've been talking to you for a while. You're going to be all right." Marmon leaned forward and rested his head gently against hers. He did not speak. There was nothing he needed to add. Gundred gathered her things from the far corner of the room with the discretion of a woman who understood precisely when she was no longer needed, and when a door should be left softly closed behind her. She stepped into the corridor. Bess, Harlan, and Clyde were on the bench against the opposite wall. All three stood up the instant the door opened. "Healthy," Gundred said. "Mother is well. Baby is well. It's a boy." Harlan sat back down and put both hands over his face. "I am not." "You are," Clyde said. "Both eyes. Both eyes." "Yes." Harlan said nothing else. Clyde put a hand on his shoulder and left it there, and did not say another word, because some moments are not improved by commentary. Bess stood with her arms folded and her eyes on the closed door. She allowed herself, for exactly one moment, the expression of a woman who had believed in something long before it had given her any reason to. A woman who had sat at kitchen tables and filed patrol schedules and followed her Alpha into the corridor at dawn and stood at gates and forest tree lines, and had believed, steadily and without announcement, that this was going to come out right. Then she straightened. "Someone should go down and tell the pack," she said. "Already done," Harlan said from behind his hands. "I sent a runner 20 minutes ago." Bess looked at him. 20 minutes ago? How did you? "I've been timing the labor since the 3rd hour, I calculated." Clyde looked at the ceiling. Bess closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then, "Good work, Harlan." Harlan lowered his hands. His eyes were red. His spine was very straight. "Thank you," he said, with the full dignity of a man who had just been given something he would be thinking about for a while. "I have been working very hard." Below, in the great hall, the pack was already beginning to celebrate again. This time, the Luna was not watching from the gallery above. This time, she was at the center of it, where she had always belonged, where she had always been heading, even on the nights when she had not been able to see how far the distance was, or what was waiting at the other end of it. Her name was Lyra Finch Richmond. She was 23 years old. She had arrived at Ironveil in a borrowed dress and a borrowed smile, and had spent 3 months learning how to exist inside a life she had been placed into without being asked. She had stood on a gallery above a hall that did not know she was there, and she had heard something that broke the life she had been building in two. She had packed her traveling satchel and left a silver pendant on a dark pillow, and walked into the night carrying the one thing no one in that hall had known about. She had spent 40 days in the neutral wild, in a stone shelter she cleared and sealed with her own hands, in a forest that asked nothing of her and received her completely. She had talked to her son by a small fire. She had sat with a mating bond that ached and not let it make her decisions. She had come home on her own terms, when she was ready, standing, She had not needed rescuing. She had needed the world she was walking back into to have changed. It had. And in the great hall below, the pack of Ironveil celebrated a victory that had nothing to do with battles fought on a ridge, and everything to do with what one woman had been quiet enough to carry, strong enough to protect, and wise enough to wait for. The end.